You're listening to The Damp Within. Tonight's story is Behind the Mask of Love. This case is among the most unsettling, not simply for what happened, but for how long the truth was kept from view. At first, it appeared to be a tragic, even romantic conclusion. A woman with a terminal illness and her devoted husband choosing to leave life behind together. That was the story presented by the media. That was what the public was meant to believe. But the facts behind it were far more disturbing and far more violent. Richard Horn, better known by his pen name Harry Horse, was a celebrated children's author and illustrator. His career was known for whimsical storytelling, imaginative illustrations, and a reputation for creative eccentricity. He lived in Shetland, Scotland with his wife Mandy, who had long battled a debilitating chronic illness. In January 2007, both were discovered deceased in their shared home. Initial reports framed their deaths as a mutual act, a so-called Romeo and Juliet suicide. The assumption was that Mandy's condition had become unbearable, and Richard, out of love and sorrow, ended both their lives peacefully. The public grieved a romantic tragedy. For a time, that version stood unquestioned, until evidence surfaced that pointed in an entirely different direction. The night before their deaths, close friends had dinner with the couple. Throughout the evening, Richard exhibited erratic behavior, agitated, unpredictable, possibly under the influence of medication or another substance. At one point, he reportedly said, "It's a wonderful night for a killing." It was said with a smile. Those present didn't act. Mandy notably asked the guests to stay the night. She said she was uneasy, but they left thinking it was nothing more than a mood swing or stress. By morning, one of those guests returned to the home to retrieve something forgotten. What they found was alarming. The couple's cat and dog had both been killed, not euthanized, not poisoned, physically killed. In the bedroom, Richard and Mandy lay side by side. But this was not a quiet death. When authorities arrived, they maintained the narrative of a mutual suicide and allowed it to circulate widely. But forensic examination told a story that the public wouldn't hear for another 6 months. Mandy had been stabbed more than 30 times. She had defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, clear signs that she resisted. The knife Richard used had broken during the assault. He went to retrieve a second knife to finish the act. Only after that did he turn the weapon on himself. His own wounds, 47 in total, were self-inflicted. This was not a shared decision. It was not mercy. It was rage. It was murder. And what followed was silence. For half a year, The official version remained unchanged. News outlets continued to portray a story of sorrowful love, a beautiful ending, all the while the truth, the violence, the resistance, the brutality was sealed away in autopsy files. When the details finally emerged, they shifted everything. Family members of Richard later revealed that his behavior had changed. Leading up to the incident, he had grown withdrawn, less communicative, secretive. His sisters believed the act was premeditated and that he had ensured no one would intervene. One line stands out in particular. He didn't want to be talked out of it. That mindset speaks volumes. Richard knew what he intended to do. Mandy had no chance to stop it. The fact that authorities initially withheld the truth, allowing the false narrative of mutual death to persist, is deeply troubling. It wasn't just a misrepresentation. It was a failure to honor Mandy's memory as a victim of violence. She was not a willing participant in her own death. She was not part of a pack. She was someone who tried to survive. Every sanitized headline, every romanticized obituary erased that reality. This was not the story of a man too heartbroken to live without his wife. This was the story of a man who made a calculated decision to take her life and then his own. Mandy deserves to be remembered for who she was, a woman who fought back, who asked for help the night before, who tried to protect herself when that help didn't come. Her death should never have been reduced to poetic tragedy. It was a brutal act of intimate partner violence, and while Richard's name remains tied to his work, Mandy's should remain tied to the truth that she resisted, that she mattered, and that her story should never have been hidden behind the mask of love. You're listening to The Damp Within. Tonight's story is The Murder of Grant Nelson, A Ride into Darkness. There are crimes that break you slowly like a quiet grief. Others shatter your sense of security in an instant. But some crimes manage to do both. They devastate and terrify, leaving behind a silence that doesn't fade, a kind that lives in the background noise of every late-night shift. This is one of those stories. It was May 30th, 2017, Memorial Day. While most people were ending the holiday weekend with backyard barbecues, fireworks, or long drives back from the lake, Grant Nelson was working. He was 34 years old, juggling 3 jobs, trying to make ends meet. One of those jobs was driving for Uber. That night, Grant accepted a ride request near a local Walmart in Skokie, Illinois, just a short drive away. The timestamp was just after 3:20 a.m., that hour of the morning, when most of the world is asleep and the air feels heavy with stillness. Streetlights buzz softly. Apartment buildings breathe in darkness. It's the hour that most people trust the quiet, but that quiet was about to be broken in the worst way. Grant was driving a gray 2014 Hyundai Sonata. Security footage would later show him pulling into a condominium parking lot not long after the ride started. And then chaos. He stumbled out of the vehicle, staggering, clutching his chest, his hands both soaked in blood, wounded, barely upright, barely alive. He made it to the lobby of the building. What followed was desperation. Residents were jolted awake by the frantic sound of the intercom buzzing again and again, and then came the voice, strained, cracking, barely above a whisper, but filled with a terrifying clarity. "Help me, I'm going to die." That sentence hit harder than any siren. Inside the building, people rushed to the door. Some called 911. Others froze. The footage showed Grant slumped against the glass, slipping downward. His blood smeared the entrance. When first responders arrived, he was still conscious, barely. Despite his injuries, Grant managed to speak. Just a few words, but enough. Uber driver picked up from Walmart. Passenger attacked me. It was a final act of strength. A dying man helping to catch his own killer. He was rushed to St. Francis Hospital in Evanston. Doctors tried, but his wounds were too severe. He died shortly after arrival, and suddenly, what began as a routine rideshare was now a homicide. Police launched a full investigation. Who had requested the ride? What was the motive? There was no robbery. Grant's wallet wasn't missing. His phone was still there. His car was intact. And then came the real shock. The suspect was 16 years old, a teenage boy. No criminal history, no connection to Grant, no gang affiliation, no robbery attempt. Just a violent, sudden, and completely unprovoked attack. The knife was found. The timeline was reconstructed through security footage, phone records, and testimony. It was a blitz. Fast, furious, without warning. Grant didn't stand a chance. Think about that for a moment. He wasn't arguing with anyone. He wasn't meeting a stranger in a dark alley. He wasn't chasing danger. He was working. He was trying to make rent. And within minutes, everything was gone. His life, his future, his breath. The attacker never gave a real explanation. There was no manifesto, no cry for help, no mental break that could be clearly defined. Just a chilling void where motive should be. And in that void, the community was left with questions no one could answer. What made a teenager commit murder without cause? How do you protect against violence when there is no warning sign? Grant Nelson's death became a symbol not of failure, but of vulnerability, the kind we all carry when we offer help to strangers, when we trust the apps we use, when we believe that 3:20 a.m. can still be safe if we're careful. His family remembers him not just as a victim, but as a fighter, a man who, even while dying, thought to identify his killer, who tried to survive not just for himself, but for the safety of others. The case went to trial. Justice was served in the legal sense, but justice in truth is never enough when life is taken without reason. Grant Nelson deserved more than a court sentence. He deserved the rest of his life, the weddings he would have attended, the conversations he hadn't had, the nights off, the ordinary mornings, the things we all take for granted. Instead, his story ends in the cold glow of an apartment lobby. His blood on the glass, his voice on a 911 tape, and that story reminds us of something we try not to think about. That danger doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it just opens the back door of your car, sits behind you quietly, and waits and waits. You're listening to The Damp Within. Tonight's story is Jazz and Taz Whitehead. Some stories stay with you because they show you how cruel the world can be. Others stay because they shake your sense of what's real, what's safe, what's sacred. And then once in a while comes a story so raw, so unnatural, that even after the facts settle, the weight of it never does. This is that kind of story. It's about betrayal, the deepest kind, not between enemies, not strangers, but between blood, between a mother and her daughters. Nikki Whitehead was 34 years old, a single mother, a woman who had fought through hardship to give her twin daughters a better life. Jasmine and Tasmia, Jazz and Taz were her world. She raised them in Conyers, Georgia, a small town just outside Atlanta, where the streets were quiet, the houses modest, and the violence rare. From the outside, their family looked ordinary, loving even, a woman trying to hold it together, and two bright, beautiful teenage girls with their whole futures ahead of them. But behind the walls of their home, the story was different. The twins had spent years living with their great-grandmother while Nikki tried to build stability. When they moved back in with her, full-time tension erupted almost immediately. There were rules, curfews, demands for respect and responsibility, but also a mother's love, imperfect but deeply real. Nikki wanted her daughters to have the discipline she never had, the chances she never got. She saw their potential. She pushed hard, maybe too hard, and the girls, they resisted. Every rule felt like a wall. Every curfew a prison. They weren't just growing. They were hardening, testing boundaries, and Nikki was trying to stand her ground alone. What began as arguments turned into physical altercations. The police were called more than once. Social workers got involved. Reports were written. There were signs, yes, but no one could have predicted what was coming. By the time the twins were 16, the household had become a battlefield. And then, on the morning of January 13th, 2010, the tension exploded. Nikki didn't show up for work. Her boyfriend grew worried. A family member checked the home, and there in the bathroom was Nikki's body. She had been beaten and stabbed to death. The scene was brutal, not just violent, but intimate. The kind of rage you don't find in random crimes. There were signs of a struggle throughout the house. Furniture knocked over, blood in multiple rooms. It wasn't clean. It wasn't quick. It was personal. Jazz and Taz told police they had come home to find her like that. They were tearful, shaken, but not convincing. The story didn't fit the crime scene. There was blood on clothes that had been hidden, scratches that couldn't be explained, and then came the interviews, long tense unraveling the truth, one contradiction at a time. Eventually, they broke. The twins confessed it had started as an argument, like so many before it. But this one escalated fast. Words turned to shouts, shouts to shoves. Then one of them grabbed a pot from the stove. The other got a knife. Nikki fought back, but 2 against 1. Even a strong mother can be overpowered. She was hit. She was stabbed. Again and again and again. This wasn't a sudden loss of control. This was rage layered over years. Resentment turned to hatred. Hatred turned to action. And when it was over, their mother was gone. The girls were arrested and charged with murder. For years, they denied their guilt. They clung to their alibi, tried to live with the lie, but in 2014, both took plea deals, both admitted the truth. Both received 30-year prison sentences, 30 years for the murder of their own mother. There are many kinds of horror in the true crime world, but this cuts differently because Nikki didn't die in the hands of a stranger. She died in her own home, in her own bathroom, at the hands of the very children she had given life to. Children she had fought for. Children she had loved even through the chaos. We often talk about monsters in crime. We picture shadows in alleyways, faces on wanted posters. But what happens when the monster isn't hidden? when it sits at your dinner table, sleeps under your roof, and calls you Mom. That's what makes this story so unbearable. Not just the violence, but the betrayal, the inversion of something sacred. When I imagine Nikki's final moments, I don't picture fear. I picture disbelief. A mother looking into the eyes of her daughters, the same eyes she once watched over cribs and held through fevered nights, and realizing they weren't going to stop. Not this time, not until it was done. And that is a kind of heartbreak that language can barely hold.